Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to tackle something I know a lot of you struggle with, even native speakers like me sometimes.
Ooh, exciting. Lay it on me.
It's make versus do. Those two little words that can cause so much confusion.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tricky.
Well, luckily we found this super helpful video that explains it all, really visually for language learners.
Sounds good to me.
And I think it's going to give us a really great starting point for our discussion today. So you ready to untangle this grammar puzzle together?
Absolutely. I'm always up for a good challenge. Plus, it's fascinating how such small words can have such a big impact on our communication.
Yeah, it's true. It's like on the surface, make and do seem pretty straightforward, right?
Right.
But then you run into those situations where it's like, wait a minute.
I know exactly what you mean.
Like make a decision or do a decision. Which one is it? So this video, it starts out by giving us those basic definitions. So make, it says, is all about creation, building something new, bringing something new into existence.
Makes sense.
And then do is more about actions, tasks, processes, that kind of thing.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But is this a universal thing? I mean, do all languages have this distinction between make and do?
That's a great question. I was actually wondering the same thing myself.
It is, isn't it? I mean, I've dabbled in a few other languages, and it seems like they're usually separate verbs for creating and doing.
Right, but it's probably not as simple as a one-to-one translation, I'd imagine.
Exactly. The lines can get a bit blurry depending on the language and its history. English, especially, has this tendency to borrow words and concepts from all over the place.
Oh, I know. It's such a mishmash of influences.
It really is. And that actually makes it super interesting from a linguistic perspective.
Totally. But, okay, so for now, I think we should just kind of stick with those basic definitions from the video and kind of see where they lead us. So the video uses the examples of making a cake and making plans.
Okay, two very different types of creations there.
Exactly. And I think that's like really smart because it shows you right away that make doesn't always have to be about a physical object.
Right, you're not always holding a hammer and nails when you're making something.
Exactly. You can make a difference, make a mess, make time for something. It's often about like causing a change or bringing something new into being.
And that's a really subtle distinction that I bet even a lot of native speakers don't consciously think about. It's not just the cake that's new, it's the situation, the arrangement, the feeling, whatever it is, you're bringing it into existence.
And that's why it can be so tricky for people learning English. It's like there's this underlying concept that's not always super obvious.
It's like a hidden layer of meaning.
Exactly. Okay, so now on the do side of things, the video uses the examples of doing homework and doing yoga.
Again, two very different activities, but they both kind of fall under that task or process umbrella.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting to think about the implications of those choices. Like what does it say about our perception of those activities?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, take making a promise, for example, versus, let's say, doing a favor.
Ooh, yeah, good one.
Technically, both of those involve actions.
Right.
But making a promise
Yeah.
implies a higher level of commitment, intentionality.
Yeah. It feels more serious somehow.
Right. It's almost like you're creating something more substantial, more lasting.
After you're putting more of yourself into it, right?
I think so.
So even at this really basic level of just those basic definitions, there's more nuance to make versus do than you might initially think.
Absolutely. And it only gets more interesting from here.
Oh, I know. I can already feel the rabbit hole opening up beneath us.
We're about to dive deep.
But before we get too lost in the weeds, let's just kind of take a moment to appreciate the foundation we've built so far. I mean, we've got those basic definitions down. We've seen some examples.
Right. We're starting to get a feel for the subtle differences.
Exactly. And now this video, it actually gives us this handy chart. It directly compares make and do in those situations where people, often get confused.
Helpful little cheat sheet almost.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the examples that really stood out to me was making dinner versus doing the cooking.
Ah, that's a classic one.
It is, isn't it?
Because on the surface, they seem so similar. But there's actually a really important distinction there.
So explain it to me. Break it down.
Okay, so making dinner, that encompasses the entire process.
Yeah.
The planning, the shopping, the preparing. It's about the whole act of providing a meal.
Okay, so it's more holistic, big picture thinking.
Exactly. Whereas doing the cooking, That's really focused on the physical act of preparing the food.
So make is the grand plan and do is like hands-on in the kitchen.
Yeah, got it.
Okay. That makes so much more sense now. It's like one of those optical illusions where you can see two different images depending on how you focus.
I love that. That's a perfect way to describe it.
It is, isn't it? It's like same basic elements, but the perception shifts.
And that's what makes language so fascinating. I mean, it's not just about conveying information. It's about shaping meaning and perception.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect place to pause for now.
Okay, leaving them wanting more.
Exactly. Because we've got so much more to dig into. And when we come back, we'll explore some of those trickier areas, like phrasal verbs. And, well, let's just say things are about to get even more interesting.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. I don't know about you, but I'm finding this whole make versus do thing pretty fascinating.
Right, me too. It's like the more we dig into it, the more there is to discover. But you mentioned before the break that things get even trickier when we start talking about phrasal verbs. And oh boy, those are always a challenge for me, even as a native speaker.
Phrasal verbs, yeah. Those can be tricky.
They really can. So for anyone who maybe isn't familiar with the term, can we just do a quick refresh on what phrasal verbs even are and why they can be so confusing?
Absolutely. So a phrasal verb, it's basically a verb that's combined with a preposition or an adverb.
Okay.
And together, those two little words, they create a whole new meaning.
Right. It's like 1 + 1 equals something completely different.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so tricky, because the meaning isn't always obvious just by looking at the individual words.
Right. It's not like you can just logically deduce it.
Exactly. So for example, you can make up a story, but you do up a button.
See, it makes no sense. Why is it make up and not do up a story?
Right. It feels very arbitrary sometimes.
Like we make up a face with makeup, but we do up our hair. What's the logic there?
I know. It's a real head scratcher. And unfortunately, there's no magic formula for figuring out phrasal verbs. It really comes down to exposure and practice.
That's what the video kept emphasizing. Seeing phrasal verbs used in real life contexts.
Yeah, that's key.
Yeah.
Because it helps you understand not just the meaning, but also the feeling of the phrase.
Exactly. It's like when you're learning a new dance move.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
You wouldn't just read the steps in a manual, right?
No way.
You'd want to see someone actually demonstrate it. And I think it's the same with phrasal verbs. You need to hear them in action to really get a feel for how they work. But are there any patterns or clues we can look for to help us navigate this crazy phrasal verb maze?
Well, with make, the phrasal verbs often have something to do with creating or producing something. So think about making up a story, making out a check, or making over a room. It's often about bringing something new into existence or transforming something that's already there.
So it still has that core idea of creation, even though it's combined with other words.
Exactly. And then with do, the focus often shifts more to actions or tasks. Like you do up your shoelaces, you do away with a bad habit, you do over a project that wasn't quite right the first time.
Okay, so paying attention to the bigger picture can help us figure out which verb might be a better fit.
Right. But honestly, sometimes it just comes down to remembering the specific combination.
So it's like learning vocabulary words almost. You just got to memorize them.
It really is.
Yeah.
And even native speakers get tripped up by phrasal verbs sometimes. It's just part of the fun of English.
Oh, the joys of language. But speaking of fun, are there any resources or tips you'd recommend for mastering these tricky phrasal verbs? Besides watching tons of videos like the one we're talking about, of course.
Well, there are some really great online dictionaries and grammar guides that are specifically dedicated to phrasal verbs.
Awesome.
So you can look up, specific verbs, you can see detailed explanations, and you can see lots of examples of how they're used in context.
So it's not just a definition. You actually get to see them working in the wild.
Right, exactly. And you can even create your own flashcards or lists to help you memorize those tricky combinations.
Yeah, good old-fashioned flashcards. Those always work. But honestly, I think one of the most effective ways is just to immerse yourself in the language. Read books, watch movies, listen to podcasts, have conversations with native speakers.
Absolutely. The more you expose yourself to authentic English, the more those phrases will just start to sound natural and familiar.
It's all about that constant exposure, letting it seep into your brain.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I know it can feel overwhelming sometimes, especially when you're first starting out.
Oh, for sure. Those phrasal verbs can feel like a never-ending mountain to climb.
Yeah. But don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
Right. I think it's important to remember that even native speakers make mistakes with phrasal verbs sometimes.
Oh, all the time. It's totally normal. The key is to be patient with yourself, keep practicing, and try to have fun with it. Think of it like a linguistic treasure hunt. The more phrasal verbs you discover, the richer and more nuanced your English becomes.
I love that analogy. It's not a chore, it's an adventure. Okay, so we've conquered phrasal verbs. What other make versus do nuances should we explore?
Well, there are some cases where both make and do actually seem possible,
Okay.
but one is preferred over the other.
Oh, interesting. Based on what?
Well, it's kind of one of those things that you just pick up as a native speaker, but it can be really confusing for learners.
So it's like there's no hard and fast rule, it just sounds better one way or the other.
Pretty much. And it's these subtle preferences that can really make someone's English sound, really polished and fluent.
Right, even if their grammar is technically correct, it's like that extra layer of like naturalness.
Exactly. Like you mentioned earlier, you can make a decision or you can do a decision.
Yeah.
But make just sounds more natural to a native speaker's ear.
It does, doesn't it?
And there are often like subtle reasons for these preferences. I mean, in the case of make a decision, it's probably because make emphasizes the act of creating that decision, bringing it into being.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Whereas do just feels a little too generic and action-oriented in that context.
Right. Make really captures that sense of actively forming something new, like you're putting thought and effort into it.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just random, there's actually a deeper logic at play here.
There often is. And this principle applies to other collocations too. You make a mistake, but you do damage. You make a phone call, but you do business.
Interesting. Is there like a pattern there?
Well, make often implies creating something unintentional.
Like a mistake.
Right. Whereas do suggests some more deliberate action that has a more tangible impact.
Okay, so make is kind of like, oops, didn't mean to do that. And do is like, I'm taking action and making things happen.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so exciting about language learning. It's not just about memorizing rules. It's about uncovering the why behind those rules.
Totally. Because when you understand the why, then you can start to use the language more creatively and effectively.
Exactly. You become more than just a rule follower. You become a language artist.
I love that. Okay, so we've tackled phrasal verbs, we've delved into collocations, we're really starting to get a handle on this make versus do thing, but I have a feeling there's still more to uncover.
Yeah, absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface.
Okay, we're back for more make versus do. I'm ready to dive even deeper into this. What else do we need to know?
Well, there's one more layer I think we should peel back.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me with it.
So far, we've been talking about these rules and patterns as if they're like set in stone. But the truth is, language is always changing and evolving.
That's true. I mean, even in my lifetime, I've seen new words pop up and old words take on new meanings. It's pretty wild when you think about it.
And one of the biggest drivers of that change is, well, geography. The way people use language can vary a lot depending on where they are in the world.
Ooh, okay, you mean like those British versus American English differences, like
Right.
lorry instead of truck or flat instead of apartment, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Exactly.
I love those little quirks. Do make and do get caught up in those transatlantic battles, too.
They do. And it's a good reminder that there isn't always one right answer when it comes to language.
Right. It's more about understanding the nuances and being able to communicate effectively in different contexts.
Exactly. And those regional variations, they add a lot of color and personality to the language.
So spill the tea. Tell us about some of those regional differences with make and do. What should we be looking out for?
Okay, so for instance, in American English, you'd usually say, make a phone call. But in British English, you might say, give someone a ring, or just phone them.
Huh. Okay, so same action, different verb.
Yep. And for someone learning English as a second language, that can be really confusing.
I can only imagine. So what's the solution? Do language learners need to, like, memorize all these regional variations?
That's a good question.
Huh.
And honestly, I think it's more important to focus on understanding the core principles of make versus do that we've been discussing.
Okay, so master the basics first.
Right. And then be aware that usage can be flexible, especially in today's world where, we're interacting with people from all over the globe.
That's a good point. I mean, language isn't about being a robot who follows all the rules perfectly. It's about connecting with people and making yourself understood.
Absolutely. And that's where being a good listener comes in. When you're exposed to different dialects and accents, pay attention to how people use make and do.
So just absorb it naturally.
Exactly. And if you like the way something sounds, you could always try incorporating it into your own language.
It's like adding new spices to your linguistic repertoire.
I love that analogy. You've got the base recipe down. But then you can sprinkle in these regional flavors to make your communication more nuanced and interesting.
Exactly. So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the basic definitions of make and do, those tricky phrasal verbs, those subtle collocations, and even touched on some regional variations. I feel like my brain is bursting with new knowledge.
As it should be. But it all comes down to practice, really.
Practice and patience, right?
Yes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Hmm.
Pay attention to how native speakers use these verbs. And most importantly, have fun with it.
Yes. Language learning should be an adventure, not a chore. And speaking of adventures, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay, time coming for air.
But before we go, I just want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
I'm all ears.
We focused a lot on the grammatical rules of make versus do, but I think it's really important to remember that these seemingly small choices, they can actually have a huge impact on how we communicate and how people perceive us. It's not just about getting the grammar right. It's about using language to create the effect we want.
That is such a powerful insight. And honestly, I think that's the perfect takeaway for our listeners. Go out there, experiment, and most importantly, have fun with language. Until next time, happy communicating, everyone. Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling those two tricky verbs, make and do.
Ah, yes, make and do. The verbs that cause even native English speakers to pause and think sometimes.
Absolutely. That's a question I get all the time, which one is it? Make a mistake or do a mistake?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to break it all down.
And hopefully by the end of this, everyone listening will be using make and do like pros.
Like total pros. So let's get right to it. Could you give us a good working definition for each of these verbs?
Well, at its core, make usually means to create or construct something new. It's about bringing something tangible into existence.
Okay. Tangible, so like making a cake.
Exactly. Or making a decision.
Oh, that's a good one. We're not physically building a decision,
Yeah.
but we are creating a choice.
Right. Make often implies that the action results in something new coming into being. And what about do? What's your take on that one?
Well, make is about creating something, then do seems to be about actions or tasks, right?
Yeah.
Like doing your homework or doing yoga.
You got it. Do often focuses on performing an activity. It's about engaging in a process or completing a task.
Okay, so make for creating, do for acting. But I have a feeling it gets a bit more complex than that, right?
Oh, it does. There are definitely some gray areas where those lines blur a bit. And then, of course, you have those idiomatic expressions that just have to be memorized.
You mean like make a mistake or do your best?
Precisely. Those are where the history of language really gets interesting.
Oh, I love a good language history lesson. Tell me more.
Well, for example, the phrase make a mistake actually comes from the Old Norse word mistake, which meant to take in error.
Wow, that's fascinating. It makes you think about how the way we perceive mistakes has evolved over time.
And that's the beauty of language. It's constantly evolving, absorbing new meanings, and reflecting the changing ways we view the world.
I'm already feeling like I understand these words on a whole new level,
Hmm.
but I'm guessing the real challenge comes when make and do seem almost interchangeable.
Exactly. There are situations where either verb could technically work, but the subtle meaning shifts depending on which one you choose. And that's what we'll tackle next.
Oh, this is getting good. I can't wait to untangle those tricky scenarios. I bet our listeners are on the edge of their seats too.
Okay, so are you ready to dive into some of those scenarios where make and do can really trip us up?
I am so ready. Hit me with your best shot.
All right, let's talk about food. Specifically, let's talk about dinner. Would you say making dinner or doing the cooking?
Ooh, good one. I think I'd probably say making dinner because it feels like you're creating a meal.
Yeah, you're right. Making dinner does have that sense of creating a complete experience. But what if we focus on just the act of preparing the food?
Then it becomes doing the cooking. Like, hey, honey, I'm doing the cooking tonight. You set the table.
Exactly. Doing the cooking zeroes in on the specific action, while making dinner encompasses the whole shebang.
Okay, I see that. So it's like make for the big picture, do for the details.
That's a good way to think about it. But, it wouldn't be a true deep dive if we didn't explore some even trickier examples.
Oh, I knew there were more. Lay it on me. What else have you got?
How about this one? Making a plan versus doing the planning.
That's a tough one. I think they both sound okay to me. Is there really a difference?
Well, think about it this way. When you make a plan, you're focused on the end result, that tangible plan you can hold in your hand.
I see, like a plan for a trip, a list of all the things you're going to do and see.
Exactly. But doing the planning emphasizes the process itself, all the steps involved in creating that plan.
Oh, I get it. So doing the planning is like brainstorming, researching, making lists, and then making a plan is that final document that comes out of all that work.
You got it. It's all about those subtle shades of meaning, and that's what makes language so fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. It's like a puzzle, and every little piece fits together to create this intricate picture.
I like that analogy. But I think our listeners are ready for an even bigger challenge. Ready for the ultimate make or do showdown.
Bring it on. I'm feeling confident now, or at least I'm doing my best.
Okay, how about this? Making a decision versus doing what needs to be done?
Whoa, hold on. Those both involve making choices and taking action, right? So how do we know which is which?
Well, when you say making a decision, you're highlighting the mental process of choosing. It's about weighing options and coming to a conclusion.
So it's like making a decision is happening inside your head.
Right. And doing what needs to be done is about putting those decisions into action, taking the necessary steps, even if they're tough.
Oh, wow, I get it. So if I'm debating between pizza or salad for dinner, I'm making a decision. But if I'm tackling a mountain of laundry, I'm just doing what needs to be done.
Perfect example. You're a natural at this. It
Yeah.
seems like our deep dive has really paid off.
I feel like I've unlocked a secret code to the English language.
And the best part is, this is just the beginning. The more you pay attention to these nuances, the more you'll start to notice them everywhere.
So to our listeners out there, what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to make versus do?
Don't get too hung up on trying to memorize a bunch of rules. Instead, pay attention to the context. What are you trying to say? What feeling or emphasis do you want to convey?
And remember, language is constantly evolving. So what might be considered correct today could change over time. It's about being flexible and adaptable.
Exactly. So don't be afraid to experiment, to play with language, and most importantly, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Because even native English speakers get tripped up by make and do sometimes.
And who knows, maybe your mistakes will lead to some fascinating new linguistic discoveries.
Now that's a thought-provoking idea. But I think it's time for us to take a little break. When we come back, we'll continue exploring the fascinating world of make versus do. Ache. Welcome back to the show. You know, it's amazing how these two little words, make and do, can pack so much meaning.
It really is. And I think our listeners have done an incredible job of unpacking all those subtle nuances with us.
They're probably out there right now noticing make and do everywhere. It's like we've given them a secret decoder ring for the English language.
And that's what's so exciting about language, isn't it? There's always something new to discover, even in the words we use every single day.
Absolutely. I feel like even I've learned so much during this deep dive. It's made me realize how much thought goes into even the simplest choices we make as speakers.
I completely agree. And the more we learn about these choices, the more effectively we can communicate our ideas and connect with others.
And that's really what it's all about, right? Using language to build bridges and share our unique perspectives with the world.
Beautifully said. So, to our listeners who are now well on their way to becoming make versus do masters, what final piece of advice would you offer?
I'd say don't be afraid to experiment. Play with language, try different things, and see what feels right.
And remember, it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, mistakes are often the best teachers.
I love that, because even if we make a mistake, we can still do our best to learn from it.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe those mistakes will lead us to some exciting new linguistic adventures.
The possibilities are endless. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of make and do.
It's been a pleasure exploring these fascinating verbs with you and with all our amazing listeners out there.
We hope you've enjoyed this linguistic journey as much as we have. And until next time, keep those language muscles flexed, keep those ears open, and keep on learning.